think so.
Not necessarily you have to tell, like, if you're out on your own, you're able to. But you have to,
what the heck is happening with that?
Like,
Yeah, I'm not the person to
but
ask.
you have to be 17.
I thought you had to be 18 or older.
Yeah,
I'm not the one that asked.
If you're 18, what? You just sign up
But I
for
think it
so-
depends if you're independent or you're not. Though I am not the person to ask for that clarification. That would be
I'm
front
hungry
office.
and I need some.
Oh my gosh.
I don't
Okay,
know.
so anyways, goodness. All right, so back to this opener. We've talked, y'all. We've talked about the two major things that were necessary, not for plants to just sort of skirt around their water source, but to actually push way further inland, away from rivers and lakes and oceans. What were the two things from a little while ago now that we said that gymnosperms needed to be able to go much further inland? There are two very specific adaptations. What were they? No, plants, not animals, plants. Plants. Seeds? Okay, what are the veins called in plants? But they're called, he's right, veins in plants, that, and you're right too, it's vascular tissue, but it's called something. It allows the water to flow. No, it's called phloem. Xylem and phloem. But you're right, it is essentially arteries and veins for plants. It is, it's just not blood, it's water, and then the nutrients that it's taking with. No, I mean, you're correct, it's just not called arteries and veins for plants. Alrighty, let me unfreeze this, that would be wise, because you guys can't see what I'm doing. Oh, I didn't even plug in my, why are you not going forward? Oh, no. It's not done right. I gotta fix it.
Hey, Miss Ritchie, I don't know if you counted me here or not, but I'm here.
I'll get to you in just a second. I didn't see you before, but I'll get to it. There we go. Now it's right. I forgot to put my presumption in. You find it.
You think it's my problem, the lunch ladies for making lunch or breakfast?
If you rob a lunch lady when they make you breakfast, we're not. No, I don't.
So hungry.
I don't. Let me plug this in. I did not plug in my little projector thing. There we go. Okay, so plants. Plants started to come, plants started to move from the water to the land in the early Silurian. They're not plants like what you think of today. They were things, the algae would have come first, the cyanobacteria, but when you're talking about like plants, it would have been lichen next. Lichen is that stuff that grows on the side of trees. Sort of like, almost looks like a combination between mold and like fungus is what lichen looks like. Beyond that, we had mosses, we had ferns, seedless ferns, ones that used spores. But the plants had to adapt, just like the animals had to adapt to be able to go from being submerged in their water source to going to a terrestrial environment. So the very first plants had to stay around wherever their water source was because they whipped the water up along what eventually would become vascular tissue. It's just the first plants did not have xylem and phloem, the mosses, the lichens, the seedless ferns or the spore ferns. They didn't have that infrastructure, the internal structure to be able to do it. So vascular plants, they have that internal structure. Non-vascular plants, the ones that first colonized the land, did not. And they had to stay next to wherever the water source was. It could have been the ocean, it could have been a river, it could have been a lake, pond, whatever. But they were tied around the boundaries of said water source. And if that water source dried up, then they died. They couldn't pull the water from deep underground the way that our modern plants can. And I know you guys don't like the word moist, but
I love that word.
I mean,
Sorry, God.
Wow.
this is why I say no, that my things are not meant for children. You guys say bad words. Anyways.
I'm gonna say something bad about
Oh my gosh.
You best be lucky I caught myself. It
Uh-huh.
was real bad.
Right, so seedless vascular plants, they had that internal structure to pump the water, but they didn't have seeds yet. So this would have been the first adaptation to try to move a little bit further inland. These are ferns. Ferns still have spores. If you find a fern and you look underneath the leaf when they're getting ready to reproduce, you see these little circular dots.
Is that the eggs?
Essentially, yes, those are their
Really?
spores.
I guess.
That's basically what they are. Now, they're not seeds. They don't have that hard coat. And a spore is much easier for an insect to get into than an ingest. In fact, insects drove that seed coat adaptation later. Because, plants wanted to reproduce, not that they could cognitively, think and be like, oh, I don't like these insects. I need to make a seed coat. But the ones that developed that harder coating on the seeds, or on their spores, if you will, which created the first seeds, those were the ones that evolutionarily moved on. Okay, so green algae was first. Okay, this would have been our cyanobacteria. Erica, turn that off. And whoever it is that's making, it's either you or it's Kaden. I don't know, there's music coming from over here.
So it's not me.
But your early plants basically behave the same way as that early cyanobacteria, that green algae. If you've ever had a pond that's gotten that sort of scummy layer on it, that's what green algae is. And green algae most definitely was the first one to be able to go from a haline or a salty ocean environment into a freshwater environment, which would have been a river, and then up the river to lakes and to ponds. Beyond algae, the very first, what we consider early plant, would have been a lichen. After a lichen, would have been a moss. After a moss, would have been a fern. That would be, I don't think I put ferns after that one, I didn't know. But that's the order that the hierarchy would have been with plants. The simplest would have been that green algae, that pond scum, if you will. That's basically what green algae is. It's that gross green stuff that grows on the edges of ponds.
Pond stuff.
Pond stuff, okay, green algae. Like I said, the very first plants moved in the earlier part of the Silurian. We had the jawed fish that started at this time also, but obviously they stayed in the ocean. We had insects moving on land at the same time. We'll hit insects here in just a minute. But these things look like, for lack of a better word, it looked like a tree without leaves, is what these things look like. Little miniature branches. And then their spore was at the very, very, very top. But they didn't have leaves and they didn't have roots. That adaptation came later. Plants have something called a rhizome. Did I put that image on here? Oh, I did. Okay, I didn't. Not on this one. Oh, I did too. So over on the right-hand side. Plants have something called a rhizome. You probably planted sunflower seeds or green bean or lima bean or something when you were a little kid in a plastic cup. And then once it started to sprout, you could see almost what looked like a very pale or white colored root that was trying to grow in the dirt along the outside of the cup. That's the advanced version of what is called a rhizome. A rhizome is what helps anchor these early plants to the ground so that they don't get washed away. And that's what I have over here on the right-hand side. And I know those of you that are online can't see me pointing. So these are rhizomes. If you ever get those runners in your grass and you go to pull them up and it comes up as a big strand, it's not Bermuda, it's something else. But you pull up these runners, the grass that's not supposed to be there. Those bits that are sort of sticking off that were anchored into the dirt, those essentially are rhizomes. It's the advanced version of a rhizome, but that's what it is. The image on the top right, these were the earliest types of plants. Once again, they were completely and totally tied to their water source. They weren't ready to move further inland yet. They just hadn't adapted the right type of structure, which would have been proper roots, proper leaves to be able to absorb the light from the sun, and also do gas exchange for that matter. Seed ferns were the first ones to really move inland. Lysopteris is one of these. When we were talking about Wegener, goodness, that was the beginning of the 6 weeks now. Actually, the end of last 6 weeks. Lysopteris, that fern, that particular plant, because the fact that it had all the proper structures and it had seeds, not spores, allowed it to spread along all of the lower portion of what became Pangea, that would be Gondwanaland. But these are images down on the bottom of, and I'm honestly, I'm assuming that all of us know what a leaf and a root is at this point for a plant. But that evolutionary milestone of a hard seed coat, the shell of a seed that protected the part that was essentially the egg, the part that if it was in the right environment would sprout into a new plant. That allowed these things to just move way further inland, which allowed the reptiles to move further inland. Because we just talked about this yesterday, the amphibians couldn't. They were stuck to essentially where they were born. They couldn't move far away from a water source. They would dry out. Or they couldn't reproduce. They had to return back to water to be able to lay their eggs. Because their eggs didn't have a hard shell like reptiles do. Oh, I don't know why I didn't animate my arrow. All right, so what now? Yet. Okay, so let me get my image up. So very, very early on, now we're past the Silurian, we're into the later part of the Devonian, which is what LDEV stands for, late Devonian to early Pennsylvanian. That's what LDEV and EPEN stands for. These particular organisms, these plants, this is the bulk of what makes up our coal. And these were early plants. They had seeds, or I'm sorry, they didn't have seeds. They had the internal structure, but they did not have seeds yet. Insects devastated these things, but that insect predation on their spores drove the production of the hard seed coat. The one that arrow is pointing to that I did not animate properly in my thing, I have to go back and fix that. Those are lycospids. It's very similar to what you think of as a palm tree, but they didn't have the right type of seed structure. The one over here on the side, this is similar to a cattail. If you've ever seen a cattail before, cattails have been around for a very, I'm sure they have a proper name. I don't remember what it is. Very, very, very old design. They do have that primal root structure, but they can't get out of the water. You're not going to see, y'all have seen a cattail before, right? You know what I'm talking about? It almost looks like a hot dog. Yeah, and it goes everywhere.
I've seen people take parts on
Ew.
it. And then it's just, you
They're
never.
everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like almost like a dandelion fluff, but like on steroids.
Oh, those edible?
I wouldn't try to, and it's technically yes, but I wouldn't try to.
I thought you would choke on it.
I think you would do like the people that did that cinnamon challenge, you would eat the, and like goes into your lungs and you suffocate. Like, no, I will not try to do
Have you
that.
seen that little kid where the mother told him blowing was probably his peaceable thing?
No. Oh my goodness. Anyways, in this image, We do have insects that are shown. We'll get to insects in a second. Oh, shh. We have a couple of things that are essentially dragonflies. They were much larger than they are now. We have a couple of amphibious type organisms that are in here. Wait, black bar. And then, but our first seed ferns, they showed up in this time period, and then they started that colonization further into land, which then allowed the reptiles to push further into land. Okay, this one is from the late Pennsylvanian into the middle Permian. This is the end of the Carboniferous into the beginning, or really the middle of the Permian. And we actually have reptiles here. We have seed vascular. The previous one was seedless. They were, except for the very bottom one, they were able to pump the nutrients through their tissues, but they couldn't really protect themselves from predation from, specifically from insects. These were different. When you have a seed coat, it protects the seed from drying out, and it also gives extra protection from these insects. But of course, then the insects evolve, and then they form those stabbing proboscis, like what a mosquito does to get our blood, to be able to suck the juices out of the seed or out of the plant itself, like an aphid does. Gymnosperms, this is part of the opener. Gymnosperms were the huge milestone here because they had both. Things like ginkgos, they said the Glossopteris, they were able to go much further inland, and they allowed the reptiles then to be able to go further inland as well. And this little dude down here, where the previous one was amphibious, this one is reptilian. Excuse me. When we had the Permian extinction, we had a huge die-off because of the increase in temperature. It just couldn't survive. Things essentially became a desert-like environment. There was no water to move around unless you were close enough to the ocean. But the problem with the Permian extinction was the ocean water was toxic. So that's why so many things died off. And we are going to go into the Permian extinction tomorrow. I decided Monday. I'm going to go back and we're going to talk about each major extinction event, but we will have already done the Permian in detail, so I won't have to go over that one like I will tomorrow. The organisms that survived this extinction, which was called the Great Dying, they were able to tolerate a much more arid environment. So this included modern day plants. This included the reptiles that became like dinosaur reptiles, true reptiles, and eventually birds. This also became was also true of your mammal-like reptiles, which became our ancestors. But everything else was just destroyed. 96% of all marine life and about 2/3 of all land organisms were completely destroyed. They couldn't cope with the fact that they were used to this lush, almost marsh-like environment, not quite swamp, and not quite jungle, but this very lush environment, which then turned into a very, very arid desert-like environment. All right, insects and spiders, arachnids or spiders. They all developed in that Silurian period as well. The oldest fossil remains are from the next period, but we know that they were there before. The problem with getting the fossils in the Silurian was that plant material really wasn't available to fossilize things properly. So we get our first major body fossils specifically from the Devonian period. They came out at the same time as the plants did, and the first organisms to fly were insects. So the insects were able to fly, well, and crawl, and climb. And they were able to get to the tops of these plants where their spores were, and they fed on them. Well, like I said, not that a plant has a cognizant ability, but it doesn't want to die. It wants to be able to reproduce. So insects directly triggered the development of that hard seed coat, which was the push from a spore. Now, we still have plants that populate themselves with spores. We still have mosses. We still have that type of fern. We still have that type of lichen that are a spore-related organism and not a seed-related organism. Hey, insects. When we were talking about the vertebrates yesterday, we figured out they had to have some type of development to keep themselves from drying out. Well, insects don't really have that problem, at least not as big of a problem as amphibians do, because they have that exoskeleton. They didn't desiccate, they didn't dry out as easily as your amphibians did. Now, we know reptiles aren't quite as susceptible to drying out as amphibians, but man, the insects just took over. Your earliest dragonflies, let's see, because I know it's on the next one. Their wingspans were essentially as wide as this meter strip. And so not like be able to pick you up and carry you off, but where my hand is would be the back of the dragonfly and the wings would be the end of this meter strip. Much, much, much larger insects than they are today. But the first big, big, big dragonfly. But that body style of a dragonfly or a midge or a lacewing or a damselfly, that particular body structure has been around since the beginning of insects coming online. No, it couldn't like pick you up and carry you off. If it bit you, it would probably hurt. Because I'm sure they had mandibles just like current dragonflies do, because dragonflies can bite. And they will bite if you pick them up the wrong way.
What?
Dragonflies.
Yeah,
Bye-bye. They'll bite.
I didn't know that.
They have mandibles. They can bite. You don't pick them up right. They don't want to die. They think you're trying to kill them. They don't know any better.
I've never tried to pick up on because I always fly away.
Because they can see you coming, because they have like hundreds of eyes. They have compound eyes. They just do. They have compound eyes, just like a fly. It's a whole bunch of eyes within the eye. They can see all around them, all at the same time.
That would be true.
No, I mean, that's the way that they evolved. That's just that. I'm not getting that far into insect evolution. I'm not, but it's a compound eye. It is multiple eyes within the one eye that you think of that are all looking in different
If I
directions.
was like a dragonfly, my eye would have thousands of eyes in it.
Essentially, but it would also be like sticking off your head too. So, I mean, they're looking in all directions all at the same time.
Literally.
No. No have eyelids.
Oh, no.
You're constantly seeing. So how do they sleep? That's the other question if you're constantly seeing. I mean, you can't shut your eyes to go to bed, but no, we're not getting that far into insect evolution. We're not.
Probably it's the same as
Well, you have a point. I mean, like I said, it's not like the insects are like thinking like us.
Wait, so
I mean, fish can't close their eyes either.
Really?
They don't have eyelids.
I didn't know that. I thought everything had eyelids.
No.
Miss Richie.
Ah.
So if there was a lot of oxygen, you'd be even bigger right now.
The higher levels of oxygen will promote larger growth, plus it was warmer. So when it came to the reptiles, which most of the dinosaurs were exothermic, which means cold-blooded, they stayed in certain areas because they needed the warmer temperature, but that extra oxygen that all these plants put out, because we had this huge push of plants on the land at the same time, that helped create a larger body structure.
So we could be like giants right now.
Well, I mean, we've had giant people before. I mean, we have.
Have you not seen
names.
basketball teams?
No, I'm talking about like 9 foot, like giants, like You guys have, y'all do not educate yourself on stuff, you just don't.
Well, when you look up Johnson, yeah, it was just
Oops,
crazy.
oops, I thought there was one more on, okay, you guys are distracted.
Real life giant.
Jack and the Beast.
The higher level of oxygen promoted a much larger growth. Okay, that's why those dragonflies, like I said, where my hand is would be the back of the dragonfly, and the wings would be the edges of this meter stick. That is how large that they got at their largest. Later on, we started having more of a variation of insects. Like the first ones, like I said, they were like midges and lacewings and dragonflies and damselflies. That's what they all look like. But towards the end of the Permian, we had things that had more of a ladybug or a beetle type. The wings are held underneath that tough upper coating of their shell. All right, Permian mass extinction. I'm going to talk about this just a little bit. We're going to focus on this tomorrow. And we're going to talk about all of the major mass extinctions that we've had, and maybe some of the minor extinctions, because I haven't built notes for Monday yet. But the Permian mass extinction is called the mother of all extinctions. It wiped out almost all life on this planet. In fact, it could have wiped out all the life on this planet if the Siberian traps would have erupted longer than they did. But fortunately for the Earth, the Siberian traps only erupted for about 1 million years, and then they stopped. They put out so much carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, it increased the temperature of the planet by about 5 degrees, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but for the ocean it is. And when the ocean heated up, then all of a sudden the methane was released that was trapped underneath the ocean floor, and that drove the temperature of the planet up even more. And everything that was nice and lush and had lots of food for things to eat, and lots of water for organisms to live in and drink, it all dried up. The Permian extinction was way more devastating to the ocean than it was to the organisms on land. And so the acid rain lowered the level of oxygen in the oceans because it made it what is called anoxic, which just means low oxygen levels. And the organisms that lived on the seafloor suffocated. All right, well, that's horrible. Well, the things that were closer to the shore had more oxygen, but low oxygen levels drives up heavy metal concentration. Higher levels of mercury, higher levels of iron, whoa, you got toxins thrown in the mix. So basically everything that lived in the ocean died.
Wait, so what caused it?
Volcanic activity.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called the Siberian traps, and it's not on this one, it's on the next one. We will talk more about this tomorrow. No, it was a straight 1 million years of volcanic eruption over hundreds of miles of tear in the Earth's surface. The corals died, the reefs collapsed. There were a few things that survived in the ocean.
I could survive in the ocean.
How'd you know? With a mercury, lead, poisonous, toxic, low oxygen cesspool.
Yep,
Okay.
easily.
All right, so the causes.
Remember, I eat sulfur.
Oh, good man, I swear. But so there are a few things that all contributed to this extinction. Like I said, we'll get into this more in depth tomorrow. Pangea slammed together. Where it slammed together, what originally was coral reef was now driven up above ground, dried out. They all died. We ended up having glaciation. Once all this stuff was over, once all this insane heating was over, here comes the glaciers, locks all the water away, sea levels drop, and those few things that were trying to cling to life, most of them died because they were exposed to the earth. The Great Dying was technically before that. Like I said, it's essentially everything that was nice and lush becomes desert. But all of this was triggered by the Siberian traps, which is a volcanic phenomenon. I did find a documentary that goes over this. It's a little older, so it's not as like 4K quality as what you're used to me showing you, and it's British. So the pronunciation is a little off. Like we say methane, we don't say methane. It's just the British pronunciation. But we'll take a look at that on Tuesday. I got to figure out a way to cut the time down because it's almost 50 minutes long and we've got 45 minutes in class. So I know there's a way I can edit it, or at least figure out where I'm going to advance it. There'll still be a link to it in Canvas. But so a little bit more on the technical side. U is uranium, PB is lead. Okay, zircon is like zirconium. It's a type of mineral. There are a lot of things that we pulled out of the shield in China. Okay, the original shield platform, which was the Creighton in China. And analyzing certain things, we put that mass extinction starting at, now it's not like to the day and the month and the minute, but at 251 million years ago. It lasted for 1 million years. The volcanic ash. You have this, and I don't want to start talking about the Cretaceous one too much because I'm trying to save that for next 6 weeks, but the boundary between the dinosaur fossils below and then not being above, the KT boundary, is similar to the PTR boundary, where you have this layer. And in this case, it wasn't iridium, like it was in Cretaceous, which is indicative of an asteroid. This one was volcanic ash. You had approximately a 1 million year span of volcanic ash that was falling planet-wide. I'm pretty sure that's on the next one. Yes, the Siberian Tracts. So D is, it should be a Greek delta, but I can't get Google Slides to do the proper way that a delta is written. Delta 13 is a specific type of carbon. Knowing how long its half-life is and understanding how thick the ash beds were lets us know that essentially the planet was on fire, at least that particular region. Now China's a lot closer to Siberia than we are. We're on the opposite side of the planet. But when, that C is not blue, that's not OCD is bothering me. When Pangea split because of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, up in Siberia, at the top of that rift, you had literally approximately 1 million year long volcanic eruption. All different kinds of greenhouse gases going into the air. Sulfuric acid going into the air. Coming back down as acid rain, completely and totally changing the makeup of not only the atmospheric composition, but also the composition of the ocean and other water bodies themselves. The Siberian traps are what changed this planet in the Permian extinction. And y'all, it can happen again. And the thing that's freaky, and I haven't gone through and double checked everything, but the amount of carbon dioxide that the traps put out is nothing compared to what infrastructure is putting out from humans. So I don't want to get into human impact too much because that's supposed to be the 6 weeks, but there's a very good chance that human beings with our industry and burning fossil fuels, which burnt the coal from the Siberian traps, which caused the mass extinction in the Permian, there's a good chance that we're starting the 6th extinction of this planet because we've had 5. Where all different kinds of organisms are starting to go extinct. So I'm not like all like polar bears and blah, 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 but it's happening. And we very well may be in the middle of a 6th extinction. I've got one more image on here. This is just showing you the major extinctions. I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about this on Monday. Most extinctions, we've got a few that are asteroid impacted, but we also have a whole bunch that are glacier impacted. And like I said, I haven't built the stuff for Monday. I ran out of time last weekend to do it. And I need to go back and double check myself. Back check everything. Let me freeze this. I need to tell people what they are missing. We've got 12 minutes left in class. Let me stop this first and check